Welcome to the deep dive. Just saying ancient Greece, it conjures up these incredible images, doesn't it? Monumental buildings, deep philosophical debates, epic battles.
Absolutely. It's a world that still grabs us, really
Mhm.
challenges how we think about society, politics, power, all of it.
Exactly. So today we're taking a deep dive into two really contrasting worlds within the worlds of democratic Athens and military Sparta, two iconic city-states.
hmm
Our mission really is to unpack what made them so different, how they interacted, often clashed, and maybe surprisingly, how their legacies still echo today.
And the great thing is, for this deep dive, we have a wealth of sources to draw on. We're looking at the classic historians, Herodotus, Thucydides,
Name.
right, but also modern academic work, archaeology too, so we can get beyond just the famous stories and dig into the complexities, the sometimes unexpected realities.
Okay, let's get into it then. To really understand Athens and Sparta, we need to set the scene for ancient Greece itself. Herodotus, you mentioned him, he made this fascinating observation. He said that despite sharing the same stock and the same speech, our shared temples, religious rituals, our similar customs, basically everything that made them Greek.
They were still incredibly diverse.
Exactly. Every single city-state, every polis was distinct. Think about that. Thousands of these independent little worlds. And the size difference was huge. You had Sparta controlling, 300 square miles?
Well, no, yeah.
And then tiny polises with just a few hundred people. It's an incredible range.
And that independence is key, especially with the colonies founded during the Archaic period. They were fully self-governing, self-sufficient.
Not like later colonies reporting back to a mother city.
Not at all. They weren't ruled by their cities of origin. They were truly on their own from the get-go, a totally different model.
Right. Okay. And within these city-states, as populations grew, things started changing economically too, didn't they? It wasn't just farming anymore.
No, you start seeing the production and trade of consumer goods, pottery, cloths, wine, metalwork, real industries developing.
And this new trade, it created wealth for people outside the old landowning aristocracy.
Precisely. And if you're making money through trade, you're probably not too happy with the old guard, the oligarchs, holding all the political power, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Resentment starts to build. So how did that play out? Did it lead to conflict?
It often did. And this is where the hoplite soldiers come and these heavily armed infantrymen. Sometimes they'd actually back these newly wealthy traders or craftsmen.
Against the aristocrats?
Yeah, to install new leaders. They were often called tyrants.
Yeah.
Now, that word didn't quite mean then what it means to us now.
Right, not necessarily a brutal dictator, just someone who seized power outside the established rules.
Exactly. Often with some popular support against the oligarchs.
And speaking of those hoplites, their way of fighting was a big deal too, wasn't it? The phalanx.
Oh, absolutely. The phalanx formation.
Uh-huh.
Imagine rows of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, creating this solid wall of bronze and spears.
Sounds intimidating.
It was incredibly effective, very disciplined. It was crucial in the Persian Wars, for instance, and really underpinned Greek military success and expansion.
So all these things, the economic shifts, the political tension, the military innovations, even artistic developments, they weren't happening in isolation.
Not at all. They were all feeding into each other during this archaic period. It was sort of setting the stage, really, preparing these city-states for the huge changes and massive conflicts to come.
Okay, perfect setup. Now let's zoom in on one of those city-states, Athens, the great experiment in democracy. But interestingly, Athens wasn't always the powerhouse we think of, was it? Early on, say the 6th century BC?
No, definitely not. You had other cities that were arguably more prominent back then. Think about Argos. Its people trace their history way back to the Trojan War myths. Very prestigious.
Or Corinth?
Right. Corinth was a major trading hub. They dominated Greek trade with Egypt, Assyria, Italy. Athens wasn't quite playing in that league yet.
But then they did something revolutionary. This whole concept of the domos. Can you unpack that for us? What did domos actually mean to them?
It's a layered word. It could mean local village or just the general population. But the crucial meaning, the political one, was the assembly of citizens who actually governed the state.
The people were the government, in a sense.
In a very real sense. And Athenian democracy rested on three main pillars: the Assembly of the Demos, the Council of 500, and the People's Court, supported by other bodies like the Areopagus Council, the Archons, the Generals.
So the demos wasn't just a passive population. They were actively governing. How hands-on was it?
Remarkably hands-on. There's a great bit in Plato's Protagoras where Socrates talks about the assembly. He says when they discussed building projects, people would call for actual builders to screen.
Ah, so they valued expertise. They didn't want just anyone sounding off.
Exactly. They were pretty critical if you spoke outside your area. You kind of had to know what you were talking about, or at least people expected you to. It shows real civic engagement.
That's fascinating. And the process for making laws sounds quite rigorous, too. How did that work? Could anyone just propose a law?
Any citizen could propose a change to a law, yes.
Yeah.
The assembly met annually to discuss legislation. But there was a catch.
Okay.
You couldn't just say repeal this law. You had to propose a replacement law at the same time. It prevented legislative gaps, I suppose.
Smart. And if the assembly liked the idea,
If they voted for a change, a special board called the Nomothetai, the legislators, was picked. Their job was to review and revise the proposal. It was almost like a trial for the law itself.
a trial. How so?
Well, you'd have advocates arguing for the existing law and advocates arguing for the proposed new one. The Nomothetai would listen and then make the final decision.
It's a deliberative process.
Very much so. And once law passed, it was published inscribed on stone near important statues and read out loud at the next assembly meeting. The Nomothetai also reviewed all laws yearly to check for contradictions.
Wow. And who are these Nomothetai? Just random citizens?
They were drawn from the pool of citizens who had sworn the dicastic oath, the same oath jurors took in the People's Court. So they were bound by this solemn promise of impartiality.
It sounds like they built in a lot of checks and balances. What about other institutions, like the Council of the Areopagus? How did that fit in?
The Areopagus was a respected council, made up entirely of former archons, the chief magistrates, but getting onto the Areopagus wasn't automatic.
Ugh.
First, to even become an archon, you had to pass a public scrutiny, a dokimasia, basically checking your qualifications and character.
Okay, so vetting beforehand.
Right. And then, after your year as archon was up, you faced another public audit, the euthuna, conducted by the People's Court. Only if you passed that could you become a lifetime member of the Areopagus.
That's serious accountability. A double check.
Huh.
What about the People's Court itself, the Heliaia? Was it run with the same kind of democratic spirit?
Absolutely. They really tried to make it as democratic as possible. And they had some fascinating procedures to ensure fairness, like timekeeping.
Gamekeep.
Yeah, they use a water clock, a clepsydra, to give the plaintiff and the defendant exactly the same amount of time to speak. Precise equality.
Wow. Not just roughly equal, but precisely timed.
Precisely. And the amount of water, the time allotted, actually varied depending on how serious the case was. More time for bigger cases, naturally. For cases involving potential loss of property, citizenship, or life, they might get the whole day.
That shows a real commitment to thoroughness, not just speed. What about the really heavy stuff, like homicide?
Those cases went to the Areopagus. And the process there was incredibly solemn. The accuser had to swear this truly terrifying oath.
You mentioned an oath before.
This one involved invoking destruction upon themselves and their whole family, standing over the sacrificed entrails of a boar, a ram, and a bull. Really intense stuff.
Good grief. But even then, they weren't automatically believed.
No, not at all. The oath was incredibly serious, but it didn't replace evidence or judgment. It just showed the gravity of the accusation. There's even a story about Demosthenes, the famous orator. He was apparently fined by the Areopagus because he brought a charge of assault against his cousin, but then failed to actually pursue the case. Shows how seriously they took the whole judicial process.
Right, you couldn't just make accusations lightly. That meticulousness is amazing, and it feels like this commitment to civic life, to the demos, wasn't just internal. It fueled their outward ambition, too, leading to Pericles and the Age of Imperial Glory.
It really did. That was a transformative period. You have to remember, only about 20 years earlier, the Persians had sacked Athens, burned the temples on the Acropolis.
And they'd left the ruins there.
Yes, as a sort of memorial reminder. But Pericles proposed this incredibly ambitious, massive reconstruction program. The Parthenon, the great temple to Athena, was the centerpiece.
And this wasn't cheap, I imagine.
Not even close. The scale and expense were unprecedented. Over 5,000 talents just in the first year. That's, easily over $1 billion in today's money. It was a huge statement of Athenian power, confidence, and artistic vision, funded by their growing empire.
So Athens, starting out not necessarily on top, really leverages its democratic system and this imperial drive to become a major leading power, which of course sets the stage for conflict.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now let's pivot to the complete contrast. Sparta. The name alone just screams military, right? Citizens trained from birth in the arts of war, that's the image.
That is absolutely the standard image. The austere, disciplined, purely military state.
But is that the whole story? Or is there more complexity there, maybe even some myth-making?
There's definitely more complexity and quite a bit of myth-making, actually.
Yeah.
It's important to challenge that traditional view. Archaeology, for instance, from Sparta's archaic period before their famous system really solidified.
What does it show?
It actually shows evidence of significant wealth, trade, art. Things like ivory carvings, bronze work. We only really see a decline in those kinds of finds after the mid-6th century BC.
So they weren't always this austere society. It sounds like they might have become poorer over time.
That's what some evidence suggests, kind of gradual pauperization, rather than starting out with this rigid ascetic ideal. And this leads to the idea of the invention of tradition.
Invention of tradition, meaning?
Meaning that the image we have of Sparta, this unique, unchanging society, supposedly all laid out by the mythical lawgiver Lycurgus, was in many ways a later construct, a fantasy, as one historian puts it, a mirage invented for its own use.
So they kind of created their own backstory. Why?
Often for contemporary political reasons. Later kings, like Agis IV and Cleomenes III in the 3rd century BC, would invoke the laws of Lycurgus to justify the reforms they wanted to make. Attributing things to this ancient founder gave them legitimacy.
Okay, that's fascinating. So the eternal Sparta might be partly a political tool, but their actual government structure was pretty unusual, wasn't it? Starting with the two kings.
Oh, definitely unique. The diarchy. Two kings ruling simultaneously, one from the Agiad family, one from the Euripondid, ruled for life. Very rare in Greece, probably rooted in their conquest history. They had religious duties, some judicial power left over.
And alongside the kings.
You have the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. 28 men, all had to be over 60, plus the two kings. They served for life, too. Getting onto the Gerousia was a huge deal. Lots of rivalry among the elite families for those spots.
So kings and elders, who else held power?
Perhaps the most powerful officials day-to-day were the 5 ephors. They were chosen annually by the assembly.
Annually. So more turnover there. What did they do?
They had immense power. They could summon the assembly, preside over it, implement decisions. They really embodied the power of the state in many ways. They supervised the kings.
Supervise the kings? How?
They could even arrest them, which is pretty remarkable considering kings were often treated as semi-divine after death. There was even this monthly oath.
An oath between them.
Yeah, the ephors representing the state, and the kings would swear oaths to each other. The king promised to rule according to the laws, and the ephors promised to uphold the kingship as long as he did. A formal check and balance.
Interesting. And then there was the assembly, the appella.
Right, the assembly of all adult male citizens, probably over 20 or 30. The sources differ slightly. They could vote yes or no on proposals put forward by the kings in the Gerousia.
So they had a voice but couldn't initiate things themselves.
Correct. And there was another check. If the kings in Gerousia felt the assembly was perverting or distorting a proposal with amendments or debate, they could just adjourn the meeting. Power was definitely tilted towards the elites.
It sounds like a very tightly controlled system, which brings us to the social structure and the infamous helot problem. Can you break down the layers for us?
Sure. At the very top, you have the Spartiates, the full citizens. But their numbers actually dropped over time.
For more casualties.
Not primarily, surprisingly. It was more due to the economic system. Land ownership was key to citizenship, and the inheritance system tended to concentrate land in fewer and fewer hands. Many Spartiates lost their status simply because they became too poor to contribute their share to the communal messes.
So citizenship was tied to wealth, essentially.
Very much so. This led to a small elite within the Spartiates, maybe only 100 men, who really dominated everything: foreign policy, high command, travel.
Yeah.
Below them were the Perioikoi.
Who were they?
They were free inhabitants of Laconia, Messenia, part of the Spartan state, the Lacedaemonians, but they didn't have political rights in Sparta itself. Sort of second-class citizens. They were the farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, miners. Their towns, like the port of Githyon, were vital to Sparta.
Okay, Spartiates, Perioikoi, and then the helots.
And then the helots. This is the dark underbelly. They were the original populations conquered by Sparta, reduced to a state of serfdom, almost slavery. They vastly outnumbered the Spartiates, maybe 7 to 1, maybe even more by some estimates.
7 to 1, wow.
Yeah, the numbers are debated, but anywhere from maybe 140,000 to over 300,000 helots, compared to maybe only 5,000, 10,000 Spartiate men at certain points. They were treated brutally, forced to do degrading tasks, ritually beaten every year just to remind them of their status.
Constant oppression.
And constant fear on the Spartan side. Fear of revolt was endemic. Thucydides mentions Spartans locking their doors at night because they distrusted the helots so much. There's that chilling story from the Peloponnesian War.
What happened?
The Spartans needed troops, so they announced that any helots who had distinguished themselves in war could apply for freedom. They selected about 2,000 of the bravest, crowned them with garlands, led them around the temples in celebration.
And then?
And then they just disappeared, vanished. Thucydides says they were likely murdered in secret. It's a terrifying glimpse into Spartan ruthlessness and their ability to control information, to make inconvenient people vanish.
That's truly chilling. Okay, let's shift to daily life, the famous Spartan lifestyle, the agoge, the education system.
Right, the ago.
Right.
Rigorous state training for boys from age 7, taken from their families, raised in barracks, grouped into troops. They got basic meals, famously encouraged to steal extra food.
That punished if caught.
Severely. Scholars debate if it was purely military training and stealth, or maybe part of a ritual ordeal. And central to adult life were the syssitia, the communal dining halls.
The messes you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Life revolved around them like a permanent military camp. Even the kings had to eat there. King Aegeus II was supposedly fined once for skipping dinner to eat at home with his wife.
No exceptions. What was the food like? Just gruel.
Well, the famous black broth, basically a pork soup made with blood, salt, and vinegar, doesn't sound great.
Yeah.
But the focus was on simplicity, not necessarily tiny portions. Barley bread was a staple. Restraint was about the type of food, not starving themselves.
Okay, maybe slightly better than gruel. Now, what about Spartan women? We hear about them being athletic, tough. Any truth to the myths, like them outrunning hares?
Chuckles. Okay, the hair racing thing is definitely an exaggeration, but the core idea is true. Spartan women were unusually athletic for the Greek world. They exercised publicly running, wrestling, throwing the discus, and javelin. The idea was strong mothers produce strong sons for the state. They weren't secluded like many Greek women. And Spartan mothers had this reputation as fierce upholders of the warrior code, telling their sons to come back with your shield or on it.
What about marriage? Was that different too?
Very different. It involved a kind of ritual abduction. The bride would have her hair cropped short, dress in men's clothes, and wait in the dark for the groom. He'd sneak away from the barracks, spend a short time with her, and then sneak back.
Secret meetings.
Yeah, often until the first child was born. It maintained the focus on the male communal group. And even childbirth had a ritual. Newborns were inspected by elders.
Inspected.
Yeah, presented to the elders of the father's tribe. If the baby was deemed healthy and fit, it was accepted. If not, well, the implication is exposure, though that's debated too. Accepted babies then got a ritual bath in wine.
Wow. Everything reinforces the state's priorities. Did they even have laws about marriage itself?
They did. There were specific legal actions you could face for not marrying, or marrying too late, or even marrying badly.
Marrying badly, what did that mean?
It could mean marrying someone purely for wealth instead of good Spartan character, or marrying a coward, or even apparently marrying a woman who is too short. It shows how deeply these values about fitness, character, and duty were embedded, even legally.
Incredible. Okay, so we have these two very different societies. Now let's bring them together on the battlefield. The Persian Wars. 499 to 449 BC. This was huge for both of them, wasn't it? Forcing cooperation.
A massive turning point. It kicked off with the Ionian Greek cities in Asia Minor revolting against the Persian Empire. Athens and another city, Eretria, sent ships to help them.
Which annoyed the Persian king Darius.
Big time. He sought revenge. His first attempt, led by Mardonius, saw the fleet wrecked in a storm in 492 BC. Then he sent another force straight across the Aegean. They sacked Eretria, then landed at Marathon near Athens.
Marathon. The legendary Athenian victory. The first great test for their democracy.
Absolutely. The Athenians, heavily outnumbered, made this incredibly bold, headlong charge against the Persians, slaughtered thousands of them. It was a stunning victory. And famously, the Spartans arrived too late to help.
Right, they were observing a religious festival or something.
Or something like that. But the victory hugely boosted Athenian confidence. Then came the second, even bigger Persian invasion under Xerxes, Darius' son. This leads to Thermopylae in 480 BC.
The 300 Spartans.
Led by King Leonidas. Sparta had joined the Hellenic League by then, this alliance against Persia, and they were given overall command. Thermopylae was that legendary last stand, holding the narrow pass.
And that famous line about fighting in the shade because of the arrows.
That was done in Estes, yeah. Shows that Spartan dark humor, even facing death. Xerxes was so enraged he had Leonidas' head impaled. It highlights the sheer brutality. And you see individual stories too, like Eurytus, nearly blind, having his helot guide him into the final fight.
Contrasted with Aristodemus the Trembler, who survived and faced disgrace.
Exactly. Though Aristodemus did redeem himself later at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, that was the decisive land battle.
Who fought there?
A combined Greek army, maybe 24 states, nearly 40,000 hoplites, and, interestingly, probably half the accompanying light infantry were helots, all under Spartan command. They crushed the remaining Persian forces.
So Sparta really led the land war. What about after the main invasion was defeated?
Well, after another victory at Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor, you see Sparta's priorities. They weren't keen on defending the Ionian Greeks overseas. They preferred the idea of maybe resettling them back in mainland Greece. Shows their reluctance to commit to a big navy or overseas empire. They were fundamentally a land power.
Right. So the Persian threat unites them, temporarily, but once that recedes, the old tensions between the Greek states, especially Athens and Sparta, come back.
They come roaring back.
Oh, boy.
Which leads us inevitably to the Peloponnesian War,
Yeah.
431 to 404 BC. This wasn't just a war, it was a clash of systems, ideologies, wasn't it?
Definitely. How did their different structures, Athenian democracy versus Spartan oligarchy, fuel this and shape how they fought?
The core issue, according to Thucydides, was Spartan fear of growing Athenian power. Athens had built this naval empire through the Delian League, and Sparta, leading the Peloponnesian League, felt increasingly threatened, even though Athens offered arbitration.
And Pericles in Athens was pushing for war.
He argued Athens couldn't back down. Interestingly, Spartan provocations like demanding Athens purify itself for an ancient religious pollution, the Cylon affair actually backfired and strengthened Pericles' hand. So war became inevitable.
And the fighting itself reflected their strengths.
Exactly. Sparta, the land power, repeatedly invaded Attica, burning farms, trying to draw the Athenians out. Athens, with its navy and walls, stayed safe inside, used its fleet to raid Spartan coastlines and import food. A long, grinding war of attrition.
Were there key turning points? It lasted nearly 30 years.
Several huge moments. The disastrous Athenian expedition to Sicily, a massive gamble that failed spectacularly. A huge blow.
And Alcibiades switching sides.
Oh yeah, Alcibiades. Brilliant general. Totally charismatic, but utterly unreliable. Defects to Sparta, supposedly after seducing the wife of King Aegeus II.
Chuckles. Always drama with him.
Always. Then he advises the Spartans, later falls out with them, advises the Persians, and eventually gets recalled to Athens after an oligarchic coup there is overturned. A wild career.
So how did it finally end?
After ups and downs, the Spartans, crucially with Persian funding for a fleet, finally managed to defeat the Athenian navy. They besieged Athens. Cut off its food supply via the sea, Athens was starved into submission.
Forced to surrender.
Unconditionally. They tried to negotiate, but Sparta knew they had them cornered and rejected the initial terms. Athens had no choice but complete surrender in 404 BC. Their walls were torn down. Their empire dissolved.
A total victory for Sparta. But did that dominance last? What happened to Sparta after winning the big one?
That's the ironic thing. Their peak was relatively short-lived. First, they'd allied with Persia to win, but soon enough they were fighting Persia again, backing a rival claimant to the Persian throne.
Back to old habits.
Right. And trying to maintain their dominance in Greece led to more wars, like attacking Elis, just to assert their power and settle old scores. But internally, things were starting to fray.
Oh, so the Helots again.
Partly. The conspiracy of Cynodon around 398 BC really exposed the deep discontent simmering beneath the surface. It involved not just Helots, but also newly freed Helots, poor Spartiates who had lost status, hypomiones, even some perioikoi. One conspirator apparently said they wanted to eat the Spartiates raw.
Wow. That's visceral hatred. The cracks were definitely showing.
They really were. And politically, you had figures like King Agesilaus, who was skilled at consolidating power, often ruthlessly. He sidelined rivals like Lysander, the naval hero who won the war, while carefully playing the game of respecting traditional Spartan ways outwardly.
So internal tension, political maneuvering. What about external challenges?
Big ones. Corinth and Argos, old enemies, actually formed an alliance against Sparta around 392 BC. That was significant, bringing Argos back into the mainstream of Greek politics. But the killer blow came later. The Battle of Leuctra, 371 BC. A shocking defeat by the Thebans under Epaminondas. It shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility on land. After Leuctra, Spartan power just plummeted. Their whole society started to unravel.
The unique system started to break down.
Yeah, the old customs, the syssitia, the agoge, they gradually faded. Sparta became, well, more like other Greek states, in a way, losing what made it unique.
It's amazing how quickly that happened after reaching the peak.
It really is. By the 3rd century BC, you see those kings we mentioned, Aegeus I and Cleomenes III, trying these desperate reforms. Cleomenes even freed thousands of helots.
For money.
Yes, they paid for their freedom, raising a huge sum.
Yeah.
And he armed some of them in the Macedonian style. It shows how far things had changed, both innovation, but also desperation, really, trying to stop the decline.
What incredible contrasting journeys for both Athens and Sparta. From these unique origins through defining wars, shaping each other even in opposition, they really do represent such different ways of organizing a society, pursuing power in the ancient world.
Absolutely. And their legacies are powerful and often simplified. Sparta, even back then, was held up as this ideal, stable state, often as a deliberate anti-Athens by people who dislike democracy.
And that continued later on.
Oh, definitely. You see it influencing thinkers during the French Revolution, people looking for models of civic virtue. Even during the Cold War, you'd get these analogies, the U.S. as dynamic, democratic Athens, and the USSR as rigid, militaristic Sparta.
But reality is always more complex, right?
Always. Like, Sparta's allies in their Peloponnesian League actually had more autonomy, arguably, than Athens' allies in the Delian League, which Athens treated more like subjects. The simple myths often hide these important nuances. History is rarely that neat.
That is such a crucial reminder. It really makes you think about how often we accept these simplified stories about the past. What other hidden complexities or surprising truths might be lurking beneath the surface of historical periods we think we understand? So, a final thought for you listening. What other historical myths do you think might be ripe for a deep dive?